Stacy Alicacos, who is a academic advisor at Northeastern Illinois University, a teaching assistant in the Department of Geography, and a member of University Professional of Illinois, UPI Local 4100.
I work as an academic advisor at Northeastern Illinois University, which is a state school, and most of my students are non-traditional students, income eligible students, meaning they get Pell Grants. That's 80% of my students, and first in their family to attend university, many of them from immigrant communities. And while I was in Cuba, I could not help but see parallels while I was learning about how education is structured in the country. So in my own role, my primary work is to help my students, to help them navigate issues that usually is like affording school, finding living wages after they graduate, finding internships, navigating being a first generation student, understanding the systems of academia. And most of the barriers that they confront are things that we often fight for as workers, and my students need too. Things like affordable health care and living wages and affordable school tuition. And those are some of the ever-present barriers that really make it difficult for my students to excel. And then while I was in Cuba, of course, schooling is free. And immediately as we landed there, people were very open, as Rob shared, people were very open and were sharing. Immediately as we landed, we were received by 2 members of ECAP, which is the Cuban Institute of Friendship with the People. They were receiving all people who were coming to march in the 1st of May. And while we were casually talking, waiting for the luggages to get onto the conveyor belt, they were telling me about their grandchildren. These were some older men, and how at 5 years old, one of them, he was so proud of his grandson who was getting, in his schooling, was learning about sustainable agriculture and already was identifying the difference between weeds and foods that you could eat, plants that were edible, and could handle a machete. He showed me a video of his 5-year-old like weeding a lawn yard with a machete. And he took so much pride, and immediately they were also discussing this was a result, like just one of the many extensions of the Great Miracle, which was a campaign in 1961, a literacy campaign that took over 12 months. We actually visited the Literacy Museum, but I learned so much from these 2 gentlemen waiting for the suitcases. They had really impacted them. They were so proud of the campaign that had taught over 700,000 illiterate Cubans to read in just 12 months, and what an impact it had. So it was already apparent how proud they were of their education system, and knowing that it was free, and how the independence and competency developing these young people. We eventually got to tour a couple schools, just like the National Ballet School, which is a specialized dance program for students who are as young as 7 or 8 years old, and they are trained in ballet and modern dance, and also receive their regular school curriculum. Many of them either living nearby the school or transported in. And I remember we met these students, we saw the different age groups, some of the older students, some of the younger students, and they were all so excited and hopeful and very eager to meet us. And talking with the administrator, I asked how many of them will go on to become professional dancers, and the answer is 95% of them. And that's because they have a system that supports arts education. And that's not the only program or school that allows students to develop this way. There are also, the National Ballet School is one of the most preeminent ones and internationally renowned, especially for male dancers. But we learned that there were many other ways that students could enter into such projects or special schools, which is so hopeful to learn. And I just thought of how starkly different that is for my own students who compete to get into programs, and many of them may have a small chance of being able to actually work in the field that they study or get into the field that they compete to enter. Another school that we visited so we didn't see regular primary schools other than the National Ballet School where the students are receiving their regular education. We also visited the ILAM, which is Latin American Medical School, and that's for obviously medical students. And there we learned of how impactful and what a wonderful infrastructure they've developed internationally to allow students to study medicine, Cubans and international students, for free over a 6-year period. And I just remember being struck that, like, you know, these students were able to study on scholarship and many specializations. However, the struggles that they face reminded me again of my own students. So, you know, having insufficient fuel, and the same for the ballet school students. Having insufficient fuel meant many of them couldn't be transported to the school, and they maybe would have to take longer ways to get to school, or would have to find another school, even though because they weren't living near enough. Or students having to have shortages of soap and hygiene products, which they obviously need, of course, just for their lives. But those were the donations we made to the National Ballet School because there wasn't insufficient imports or production because of the lack of fuel. And then similar at the ELAM, at the medical school, technology and equipment, and also, again, fuel and electricity being a major challenge for the students and for the facility to be able to run their programs and train these doctors. And they've had amazing success. Not only have they produced so many, 2006 is when they opened, but they produced so many doctors internationally, and they even reference that in many other countries in Central America, some of the leadership in the health sector are graduates of the ELAM, and they noticed in particular Guatemala has 70% of the leadership in their health sector are ELAM graduates. So they really have an impact, but they're also facing challenges. Actually, in my hotel lobby, I happened to run into a student who was attending ELAM. He's from Honduras. He's becoming a specialist in cardiology. We happened to have a casual conversation, so this was outside of our tour. And he was sharing with me that he had been in Cuba for 6 months, and I asked him, how are things going? And he said, it's very difficult to be away from my family, but I really love my schooling, I really respect my colleagues, I really appreciate my training. However, it's almost impossible to study because of the rolling blackouts. It's very hard. I have to study on my computer for as many hours as I can continuously because I don't know when it will shut off. And I just imagine how that must be for a student who's trying to study medicine. Not knowing when they'll have access to work on their computer and to study their program. He also mentioned how a similar program is not available in his home country. He traveled from Honduras because he wouldn't be able to get his cardiology specialization there. And when I asked him, so that sounds pretty tough, what do you think? You think you'll stay for your 3-year program? And he said, absolutely, I'll absolutely stay. He also mentioned how difficult it was living in Havana because it's been difficult to clear the garbage. There's not enough fuel to run regular sanitation and more regularly clear garbage out of the streets. And in some neighborhoods, we've overheard that residents have turned to burning garbage, which of course causes like respiratory illnesses and other kinds of problems, and perhaps like damaging the electrical lines, the phone lines. So it's not an easy picture, but of course I think too of like my own students, how they would wish to have a free education and public programs that would support them, and they don't have access to that because they don't have health care, they can't find work that can, housing is so expensive, they can't afford their own housing, and tuition costs continue to rise. My union was just down in April 16th at the Capitol in Springfield trying to get additional funding for higher ed because we're so poorly funded, only at 35% compared to other states. So I see them as parallel challenges, and I really do think that it's so important that as workers and as people who, families who are impacted for these students and people who work alongside them or teach them, that we really need to hold the line and demand better conditions for ourselves and for the students and for the future. And that includes internationally, because there's such a benefit of that exchange and learning from other models. I also think of the brilliant work from the research, the Biotech and Genetic Research Center. They had incredible breakthroughs, many of them not available in the US, medicinal treatments that are not available for a variety of reasons. But I also think of how future researchers that I helped develop through the university are seeking affirming research, things that have a positive impact and are not just confined to profit making. That's a concern that many of my own students who in the geography department who study sustainability and want to develop sustainable projects and a future green infrastructure, which again, Cuba has many, many examples of. So I really think that these two paths of learning are really intertwined. And I was so proud to hear that CTU had gotten the students out to the May Day March. In fact, I was so proud to learn that, because I really do think that they are leading. Our students really lead, and I hope that we can see the relationship between making demands in our own areas of influence, whether that's the students or in our work and in our workplaces, to make sure that we do step towards a shared destiny, which many of the Cuban people we met expressed very openly. They always made the distinction that they love visitors from the U.S. They never confuse the U.S. government with the pueblo of the U.S. people. They believe we have a shared destiny, and I agree. Thank you.